In just 7 minutes, Jasmine Crockett exposed the unthinkable. $23 million meant for children with terminal cancer? Gone. Stolen. It was quietly funneled into shell companies, luxury events that never happened, and political deals no parent ever approved. And now it is sitting in the hands of the former president's son. Jasmine Crockett didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She calmly laid out the truth in front of the world and made Hunter Biden crumble on live TV. And his father, Joe Biden, was right there, watching it all fall apart. This wasn't just a political scandal, it was corruption. Were those children a cause or just a cover? And when the rich steal from the dying, who will speak for the child no one remembers? And to better understand this story, we have to go back to where it all began. The hearing room didn't just feel official, it felt orchestrated. The kind of place where the furniture doesn't creak and the flags don't move unless someone tells them to. There was a smell in the air, a chemical clean scent of lemon polish mixed with something colder. Control. Every chair had been arranged like a soldier at attention. Not a seat was out of line, not a cushion uneven, not a single piece of dust brave enough to land where it didn't belong. The hardwood gleamed as if scrubbed to remove more than just fingerprints. It looked sanitized, almost suspiciously so, like someone had tried to disinfect not just surfaces, but history itself. The American flags behind the committee stood stiff and unyielding, their fabric frozen mid-wave. No longer symbols of freedom, but of ceremony. This wasn't a room built to serve truth. It was a room built to make truth sit down and behave. There was even an awkward joke whispered in the back by a reporter. They polished the truth right off the walls. No one laughed loudly, but a few smirked. That kind of dark humor that comes when you know something serious is about to happen, and the system might not be ready for it. What made the room eerie wasn't just how clean it was how calm it was. Too calm. It was the stillness of a church right before someone confesses a sin that will shake the pews. Staffers adjusted microphones with forced smiles. Cameramen repositioned silently. One congressman on the right side of the panel gave a little yawn, clearly assuming today would be like any other. Statements, rebuttals, a few headlines, and then lunch. But underneath the surface of all this predictability was something colder. Something that made the skin tighten just a little too much under the collar. A reckoning was coming. Not a show, not a scolding, not a speech. A reckoning. And the woman carrying it was about to enter. The first sound didn't come from the microphones. It came from heels. Not rushed, not shy, just steady. Each step echoed like a clock ticking towards something no one could stop. Jasmine Crockett didn't glide into the hearing room. She entered it the way a countdown enters the final seconds. Her posture didn't demand attention. It made attention follow. Her face carried no expression, but somehow still delivered a message. I'm not here to perform. I'm here to reveal. Her eyes didn't dart around the room. They scanned it like a surgeon, cold and focused, already looking for the wound that needed to be opened. Aides paused mid-step. Journalists lowered their cameras for a moment. One older lawmaker leaned over and said, almost mockingly, "She always loves an entrance," and chuckled to himself. He wouldn't be laughing 10 minutes later. Jasmine didn't stop to greet anyone. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. And yet every presence in the room adjusted itself around her, like furniture shifting in a breeze you couldn't explain. The panelists who'd once looked bored were now alert. The silence had changed, not louder but heavier. She reached her seat and placed a single yellow folder on the desk. It made no sound, no thump. But it felt like something had just landed. The folder had no label, no tabs, no official seals, but it was thick, and whatever was inside, it made people sit straighter, especially the man already sitting at the witness table, Hunter Biden. Hunter leaned back in his chair, draping one arm behind it like he was relaxing at a hotel bar. He wore a tailored Navy suit and the grin of someone who believed the ending had already been written in his favor. He whispered something to his attorney. It was picked up faintly by the microphone and dismissed quickly by the room. He looked at the folder Jasmine placed in front of her, then smiled. That smile, a mix of charm and entitlement, was the kind that people in power perfect over years of never being challenged. Behind him, Joe Biden sat still, his face unreadable, his arms crossed tightly. He didn't blink. He didn't need to. His presence alone said what he hadn't. I'm still the most powerful man in this room, or so he thought. Jasmine didn't glance at either of them. She didn't flinch. She adjusted the microphone slowly, carefully, like someone loading a round into a chamber. The silence around her was total. Even the gallery seemed unsure whether to breathe. She looked to the chairman, nodded once, and then leaned slightly forward. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud or theatrical. It was measured, calm, and terrifyingly precise. "Mr. Chairman," she began, "let me be clear today. We are not judging a man. We are judging a mechanism." She paused, letting the words hang, letting their meanings settle into the polished wood and starched suits. No one moved. No one spoke. The folder remained closed, but the fear had already been opened. The mechanism. The word echoed, not just in the hearing room, but in the viewers watching from waiting rooms, nursing homes, and living rooms across America. This wasn't going to be about just one man. This was going to be about the machine that protects him, that shields the rich, that pretends charity and silence are the same thing. And Jasmine hadn't even opened the folder yet. Hunter Biden sat like a man who thought he already knew the ending. He had the posture of someone who believed the room was decoration and the people in it were props. One arm slung lazily over the back of his chair, the other resting near a glass of water he hadn't touched. Hunter projected ease like it was part of his inheritance. His suit was perfect, of course. Rich navy blue, pinstripes so faint it whispered wealth. He leaned toward his attorney and said something low, something smug. The lawyer grinned politely but said nothing in return. Whatever the comment was, it wasn't worth repeating. A few chuckles rippled from the side gallery. Not loud, just enough to confirm what Hunter already believed. This hearing was theater, and he was untouchable. Even his smirk looked rehearsed, like a man who'd been told from childhood that the rules were for other people. For a brief moment, it almost felt like he might be right. Almost. But then Jasmine moved, not dramatically, not with flair. Just one hand, calmly reaching for the yellow folder in front of her, the same one that had been sitting there, sealed and silent, like a sleeping dragon. She unfastened the flap and opened it with a slow precision that made the room go quieter than it already was. The air seemed to tighten, eyes sharpened, jaws flexed. Then she pulled out a single sheet of paper and held it up between two fingers, not like an accusation, but like an artifact. 180,000, she said, transferred on June 4th from the Hunter Biden Foundation to a private entity called Civic Crest LLC. Her voice was still level, still polite, but the numbers hit like gunfire. She laid the page on the table in a full view and looked directly at the panel. There is no staff, no listed address, no charitable work, no explanation. That was when the smirks faded. That was when even the cameraman in the back leaned in. One of them mouthed the word "damn" and kept rolling. She didn't pause for applause. There wasn't any. The room was too busy processing the pivot from smug to serious. Hunter blinked. Not much. Just once. But it was enough. Enough to suggest that the armor had a crack, and Jasmine had just found it. She pulled out a second page, then a third. $430,000 on July 22nd, she said. Same origin, same shell company. This one listed as event coordination expenses. She let that sink in. But there was no event, no venue, no staff, just the wire. She tapped the page once with her finger, not hard but sharp. The click echoed slightly like a punctuation mark. She didn't look at Hunter when she said it. She looked at the public, at the gallery, at the people who'd ever written a $20 check to a children's foundation thinking it would save a life. This wasn't theater anymore. This was an autopsy. The folder kept giving. Jasmine revealed more. 5 transfers in total. The total amount? $2.3 million. All moved from the foundation bearing Hunter Biden's name to a company no one could touch, see, or find. Every dollar, she said, laying each document down like a card in a losing hand, left a foundation for sick children and landed in a company that doesn't exist beyond paper. The room didn't gasp. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of silence that follows a wound, not the moment the knife goes in, but the realization that the bleeding won't stop. Hunter's smile was gone. His lips parted slightly, then pressed into a tight line. His eyes flicked to his attorney, who leaned in again. But Jasmine spoke over the moment, not letting it breathe. These aren't accounting errors. These aren't oversights. These are decisions. Her voice didn't rise. Her tone didn't sharpen. But her words were like ice melting into bone. This wasn't just shady, it was heartless. Jasmine let the pages stay on the table, neatly aligned like gravestones in a row. For every dollar lost, a question hung in the air. What child didn't get the medicine? What parent didn't get the call back? What life ended in silence because someone else needed another bottle of wine or another political favor? Hunter didn't move. Joe Biden, in the row behind, still hadn't flinched, but his jaw was now tight. His hands, folded calmly minutes earlier, had started to clench. Something in the room had shifted, and it had all started, not with a raised voice, not with a headline, but with a folder. And Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for theatrics. Instead, she reached into the folder again. But this time it wasn't a wire transfer or a bank record. This time it was something far more dangerous, more disarming. A single sheet of paper folded once, with a child's crayon drawing clipped to the top corner. As she held it up, even the cameras seemed to still. The drawing showed a stick-figure child lying in a hospital bed. A yellow sun filled the top right corner. There was a smiling woman on the left, big curly hair drawn in the purple marker. Underneath the picture, written in a child's messy hand, were the words, "Thank you for helping us." Jasmine's fingers trembled only slightly as she unfolded the letter attached to it. Her voice was soft, but every syllable landed like stone. "Dear Foundation," she began, "we were so grateful to hear your gala raised money for children with stage 4 cancer. My daughter Ellie was diagnosed 3 months ago. Our insurance doesn't cover her trial medication. When we called your office, we were told to be patient." She paused, letting the words sit, letting them cut. Then she continued, her voice turning quieter. "I watched the gala. I saw Hunter Biden stand there with his hand on his heart, promising to help kids like mine. I believed him. I just didn't know he was selling the promise and keeping the receipt." The room was silent, but not empty. It felt full now, with sorrow, with shame, with the heaviness of a truth that refused to stay polite. Jasmine gently placed the letter on the desk, sliding it beside one of the earlier documents. This one showed a $72,000 transaction, labeled as an event expense, dated the same week the gala aired on national television. She didn't need to say it, but she did anyway, for clarity, for the record. "That event never happened," she said. "No catering invoice, no staff payments, no venue deposit, but this wire went through." Then she looked at the drawing again, and her next words felt like a knife wrapped in velvet. "And Ellie," she whispered, "was never called back." Her voice didn't shake, but something in the gallery did. A man in the back slowly lowered his head. A woman clutched her necklace. On the dais, 2 lawmakers looked away, not because they were disinterested, but because they couldn't look directly at what they were feeling. This wasn't mismanagement. It was theft dressed in charity. Jasmine stood still, not behind her seat now, but beside the evidence, her hand resting lightly on the pages as though afraid they might fly away. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She asked a question instead, quiet, haunting, unforgettable. What happens when tuxedo promises become tombstones? It rang through the room like a bell tolling in slow motion. No one responded. Hunter Biden's composure, which had held like a fortress until now, finally wavered. His shoulders tightened. His foot tapped once under the table, then stopped. His lips pressed together and turned inward, as if holding back something more fragile than a rebuttal, Maybe a reaction, maybe a panic. Joe Biden, sitting behind him, no longer looked bored. His spine had straightened. His jaw was locked. But his eyes didn't move. They stared ahead like they were bracing for something heavier still. And then, without warning, a staffer seated near the back of the room wiped a tear from her cheek. She didn't sob. She didn't draw attention. She simply let it fall, quietly, as if even her body understood the weight of what had just been said. No one clapped. There was no applause. There wasn't even a whisper. The silence that followed wasn't just respectful. It was alive. It had claws. It dug into the skin of everyone in that room and refused to let go. It wasn't dramatic. It was devastating, because everyone there now knew this wasn't about a scandal. This was about a promise that died alongside a child who didn't have to. And no folder, no lawyer, no press release could put that truth back in its cage. The tension in the room hadn't subsided. It had merely changed shape. It was no longer the heavy silence of shame, but something colder, sharper. And just when people thought Jasmine had already delivered the final blow, the door at the back of the hearing room opened with a soft creak that cut through the stillness like a whisper. A woman stepped in. She didn't wear a badge. She didn't come with an entourage. She wore a gray suit, simple and neat, and held a small leather folder close to her chest, as if it were a confession she'd carried for too long. Her name was Samantha Kellis, and while the public didn't recognize her face, Jasmine did. So did Hunter, and that's when his body language changed. Not a lot, just enough for the trained eye to see it. His shoulders pulled in slightly, his mouth tightened, his foot tapped once, then stilled. Samantha didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She moved toward the witness table with the expression of someone walking into a storm they couldn't avoid, but had decided finally to face. When she sat down, the murmurs began. Jasmine leaned toward the mic and introduced her as a former staffer of the Biden Children's Hope Foundation. 4 years of internal access, 3 years managing disbursements, 2 years sitting in rooms the public would never see. Samantha adjusted her microphone slowly, looked down at her hands, then looked up. And what she said first surprised everyone. "We used to call it Operation Hope," she said, her voice dry but clear. "Turns out, it was Operation Optics." A few reporters chuckled quietly. One even let out a wow under his breath. A lawmaker coughed to cover a smirk. But Samantha didn't laugh. She just kept going. "I used to believe in it," she said. "I used to believe we were helping kids. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about medicine and started being about marketing." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, letting Samantha take the floor, the weight of the room shifting toward this quiet woman who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. "I watch families cry on the phone," Samantha continued. "I watch them beg. And I watched Hunter Biden order imported wine while we shredded receipts." The words hit like bricks, not just because of what she said, but how she said it, like someone who wasn't just exposing the truth, but reliving the betrayal of it. Joe Biden's jaw, already tense, seemed to harden into granite. His eyes locked forward, unblinking, as if willing himself not to react. But he couldn't stop the flush rising in his cheeks, the subtle shift in his posture that betrayed a truth he couldn't control. He knew her. He knew this wasn't fiction. Samantha wasn't a plant. She was a ghost from inside the house, and now she had come to burn it down. The room leaned in. Even those trying to stay neutral couldn't help but absorb what this meant. A woman from inside the foundation, testifying under oath, confirming the worst suspicions with the kind of tired honesty that made it impossible to dismiss. Jasmine waited. She didn't push. She didn't prod. She simply asked, "Why now?" Samantha looked not at Jasmine, not at Hunter, but at the public gallery, the families, the nurses, the quiet donors who had come hoping for accountability. "Because I watch good people cry while rich people pose for cameras," she said. "Because I thought if I waited long enough, someone else would say it first. But they didn't." Her voice dropped to a whisper, fragile but furious. "So now I will." Jasmine nodded gently and leaned back toward the mic. No further questions. But the room wasn't done with Samantha Kellis. No one moved, no one blinked. It was like the entire hearing had entered a new phase, not just an investigation, but an awakening. What had started as paper trails in financial terms had become something more primal. The fracture in the foundation wasn't just administrative. It was emotional, moral. The people in the room could feel it, like standing in a house and realizing the cracks in the walls weren't just cosmetic. They were structural, and they were spreading. The air in the chamber had shifted. Gone was the smug laughter from earlier. Gone were the rehearsed lines and safe silences. What remained now was tension so dense it seemed to cling to the wood-paneled walls. And Jasmine Crockett, as if sensing the nation's heartbeat in the stillness, didn't waste a second. She reached into the folder once again, this time pulling out a glossy printout. Not a financial document, not a letter, but a map. She stepped slightly to the side, allowing the committee's projector to fill the screen behind her with the image. A Google satellite view of a modest shopping plaza in Henderson, Nevada. No domed headquarters, no medical wings, just a vape store, a shuttered tanning salon, and an empty suite sandwiched between them. This, Jasmine said, is the official business address of Civic Crest, LLC, the entity that received over $2.3 million from the Hunter Biden Foundation. Her voice didn't rise, but her pace quickened with precision. Apparently, America's most generous children's charity operates between nicotine and UV bulbs. A few snorts of disbelief slipped out from the gallery. One staffer scribbled something, then stopped halfway through, unsure if what they were writing even made sense. Jasmine zoomed in on the screen, highlighting the suite number. Suite 206, she said plainly. No signage, no staff, no front desk. Mail returned, phone number disconnected. Then she paused, turned back to the panel, and let her voice lower just enough to feel surgical. No answers, only money. The shock started to take hold. Lawmakers glanced at one another, unsure whether they were watching a legal breakdown or the exposure of something more sinister. The moment where a house of cards didn't just fall, but disintegrated. Hunter Biden stared at the screen, unmoving. The confidence from earlier had evaporated. His fingers, once casually tapping, now curled inward. Joe Biden, still behind him, leaned forward ever so slightly, a barely visible furrow deepening across his forehead. Then came the next slide. Jasmine turned the page, tapped her remote, and the screen changed again, this time to a financial statement. Let's talk about this transfer, she said, her finger now pointing to a line item dated 6 months before the election cycle began. $600,000 wired from Civic Crest LLC directly to a political entity known as Future Forward America, a super PAC created to support Joe Biden's 2024 campaign. She didn't blink. The screen filled with arrows, wire routes, timestamps. Jasmine didn't embellish. She didn't accuse. She simply let the numbers speak louder than outrage. This isn't hope into impact, she said, lifting the PAC document and holding it beside a drawing from Ellie, the little girl who'd never gotten her call back. This is hope turned into inventory. Her voice didn't shake, but it didn't need to. It cut through the silence like glass through still water. For a moment, the room froze. Not in confusion, but in that sharp clarity that comes when denial is no longer an option. Reporters in the back scrambled to post headlines, fingers flying across touchscreens like they were typing for the first time. A young intern gasped audibly, then immediately covered her mouth. One representative, previously stone-faced, removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes like trying to wake from a nightmare that had just become real. And Hunter, once the man who laughed through whispers, now looked like he didn't know where to look. Down would admit guilt. Forward would meet Jasmine's gaze. Behind him, Joe Biden's hands had finally moved, gripping the armrest tightly, knuckles pale, as if trying to hold something together that was already unraveling. The slide behind Jasmine stayed on the screen, bright and undeniable, a fake company, a real transfer, a vanished promise. No more metaphors, no more safe distance. The theft wasn't just about money, it was about betrayal, and now the nation was watching it unfold in real time. The slide still glowed behind Jasmine, sharp, damning, and undeniable. The final wire transfer, highlighted in red, connected a nonprofit to a political war chest. The room sat paralyzed in that kind of silence where no one dares move because movement means admission. But silence doesn't last long under pressure, not when the walls are cracking. And it was Joe Biden who broke first. He stood up fast, the legs of his chair screeching against the marble floor with such force that a few people visibly jumped. His suit jacket flared open as he pointed across the room, his hand trembling not with age but fury. "This is a damn lie," he shouted. The voice that once carried in campaign rallies now rang out like a wounded lion, raw and ragged. "This is political theater. All of it." His words echoed, bouncing off the chamber walls like a storm. Reporters leapt to their feet. Photographers scrambled for angles. Some staffers froze. Others panicked. The gavel slammed once, then twice. Louder. The chairman barked for order, but it was too late. The eruption had come. Joe's face flushed deep red, veins visible along his temple, his chest heaving as he shouted over the clamor. "You're twisting the facts. You don't know what you're talking about," he bellowed, his voice cracking at the edges. He wasn't just defending his son anymore. He was defending the illusion, the story, the legacy. Hunter sat still, paralyzed in his seat, staring down at the desk like he was watching it collapse. One of the panelists reached toward Joe in a quiet plea to sit back down, but he yanked his arm away. His rage wasn't controlled. It was raw, volcanic, spilling over decades of entitlement and impunity. "You're lying," he repeated. "She's lying." The gallery was chaos. Murmurs turned into gasps. A woman near the front clutched her handbag against her chest. A reporter whispered to his mic, "We are witnessing the unraveling of a presidency's legacy." Through it all, the cameras never stopped rolling. But in the center of the storm, Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She stood still. Her expression was unchanged, her hands calm, her shoulders steady. When she stepped forward again, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't match the heat with heat. She stepped to the mic and spoke with the quiet control of someone who had spent a lifetime knowing that her truth would have to be sharper than anyone else's volume. "I represent parents," she said, "who work double shifts to send $5 to a cancer fund so their child might live long enough to see sixth grade." Her voice didn't rise, but it cut through the fury like a blade through thunder. The room for a breath went still again, not because the rage had stopped, but because it had run into something stronger. Purpose. Joe Biden's mouth remained open, mid-breath, but no sound came out. His hand slowly lowered. Hunter looked up, eyes hollow, unsure whether to speak or to vanish. Jasmine stayed focused, not on them, but on the millions watching beyond the chamber, the ones who had sent checks, said prayers, and now realized the truth wasn't buried. It had just never been spoken out loud. Until now. The room was quieter now, not because the tension had faded, but because it had transformed. After Joe Biden's eruption, after the tears, after the exposed wires and buried letters, something heavier settled into the chamber. Accountability. It had a presence, a weight. And Jasmine Crockett, calm and unwavering, reached once more into her folder. This time, what she pulled out wasn't evidence. It wasn't a drawing or a receipt. It was an envelope, long, white, unassuming, sealed with the gold-embossed emblem of the Department of Justice. She didn't speak immediately. She simply walked to the committee table, placed the envelope flat in front of the chairman, and slid it across the polished wood. The envelope didn't make a sound, but the weight of its meaning was deafening. Under the lights, the DOJ seal glimmered faintly, solid, undeniable, and final. This was no longer a hearing. This was no longer about optics or spin. This wasn't politics anymore. It was law. The seal marked the shift, and everyone felt it. The tension in the room turned into gravity. Lawmakers who had been posturing hours ago now sat motionless. A Republican congressman from Texas lowered his head into his hands, elbows resting on the desk like someone finally accepting a long-denied truth. On the left side of the panel, a Democrat, one of Joe's oldest allies, looked at the envelope and softly mouthed the word God. There was no outrage, no defense, no interruption, only the sound of inevitability. Phones vibrated, pens stopped moving. Somewhere in the gallery, a nurse who had come on her day off covered her mouth with both hands. Reporters whispered to their recorders, not with urgency, but with reverence. They knew what they were witnessing. Jasmine didn't bask in it. She didn't raise her chin or gloat. She stood beside the table, one hand still on the envelope like it was something sacred, because to the people who had been ignored, it was. Then she spoke. Our people didn't have much, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. But what they gave from the bone. It wasn't a political line. It wasn't meant for headlines. It was the kind of truth that made people in the room look away, not out of guilt, but out of humility, because they knew she was right, because every name on every donor list, every mother who emptied her jar of coins, every father who worked a third shift to donate $20, that sacrifice had been stolen, and now someone had finally put it back on the record. Jasmine took a step back, her hand leaving the envelope, letting the seal catch the light one last time. That document no longer belonged to Congress. It belonged to the Justice Department, and the reckoning at last had been handed over. A few days after the hearing, when the headlines had burned through every feed and the news anchors had already moved on to the next crisis, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office. The folder, the one that once carried evidence, letters, broken promises, now sat closed beside the official DOJ referral. She hadn't touched it since. But something else had arrived that morning. A plain white envelope with no return address, no title, just her name, written in a child's crooked handwriting. She opened it without thinking. Inside, a single folded page. Crayon drawings covered the top half. Stick figures drawn in purple and green, one with curly hair standing behind a podium, another with a red tie and a giant question mark over his head. A small American flag flapped in the corner. Underneath the image, in uneven letters, the caption read, "You reminded me what courage looks like." Jasmine smiled. A real one. The kind that catches you off guard. The kind that doesn't come from winning, but from knowing you told the truth when it mattered. That wasn't the only letter. They came in stacks, some handwritten, some typed, some barely legible. Half were thank yous from nurses, teachers, single moms. People who said, "I gave what I had," or "I didn't think anyone in Washington saw us." One letter simply read, "I buried my son and you spoke for him." But not all the messages came with kindness. The other half came in darker envelopes. Death threats, slurs, rage disguised as patriotism. They called her a liar, a traitor, a disgrace. One said, "Shut your mouth before someone shuts it for you." Another warned, "You'll regret what you did to that family." Jasmine didn't flinch. She printed every letter, every email, and filed them, not to display, not to boast, but to document, to remember what truth costs. She placed them beside the DOJ referral, page by page, building not a wall, but a record. Because history doesn't just record heroes, it records how loudly they were warned to stay silent. And then, after all of it, after the hearings, the evidence, the outburst, the referral, there was the silence. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of shame or fear or manipulation. It wasn't the silence of power trying to wait out the storm. It was quieter, more sacred. It was the silence of families at kitchen tables, watching a clip on a phone screen. It was nurses pausing in hospital hallways, fathers holding folded donation forms, teachers pinning a quote to their bulletin boards. It was Americans, not clapping, not cheering, but watching, listening, trusting, maybe for the first time in years, that someone in that marble chamber had finally spoken for them. No applause followed, no confetti, just the long, slow exhale of a nation that had watched its faith and charity begin to heal. And as the final shot fades, Jasmine Crockett stands alone in the hearing room, long after the cameras are gone. Papers gathered, folder closed. Her heels echo down the hallway like they did the day it began. And then the voiceover, soft, steady, undeniable. When justice walks in quietly and holds truth in her hands, even marble must listen. The story didn't end in that hearing room. It began echoing through the country the moment the cameras cut and the gavel fell. News anchors, for once, didn't drown the truth in spin. Headlines spoke clearly. Hunter Biden charity under criminal referral. Millions missing from foundation for dying children. Congresswoman demands justice. DOJ opens file. On talk shows and podcasts, in diner booths and waiting rooms, Americans asked a question too long buried. How could this happen? And for how long had it been allowed? The red dot on the map, the vape store and tanning salon address, became infamous. Civic Crest LLC, a name once unknown, was now synonymous with betrayal. And Jasmine's voice, calm and unshaken, played on loop. Not just her evidence, but her silence. The kind that made liars shift in their seats. The kind that refused to apologize for demanding truth. Outside the Capitol, parents gathered, not in protest, but in presence. They stood shoulder to shoulder, holding pictures of their children, some who had made it, many who had not. Nurses in scrubs clutched candles. Teachers held signs that read, "Charity is not a cover." And in the front row stood an elderly woman with silver hair and quiet eyes. A local news crew leaned in to ask why she came. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked at the building behind her and said softly, "That woman spoke for my grandson." The clip went viral within hours, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Because in a world full of shouting, a whisper from someone who's seen too much carries farther than most screams. Back inside, long after the hearing had ended and the crowd outside had thinned, Jasmine Crockett returned to the empty chamber. No staff, no media. Just her in the chair where power had once sat smug and untouchable. She stood quietly, one hand on the back of the seat, and let the silence settle again. Not because she was afraid of it, but because this time, the silence belonged to her. She looked down at the folder on the desk, still sealed, the DOJ referral now in the hands of people who could take it further than even she could. And then, with the lights dimming and the sun outside beginning to fade over the dome of the Capitol, she turned to the camera just once more. Her voice was low, not rehearsed, just real. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone," she said. "I came here to end the silence." And for once, America listened and didn't look away. The characters and events depicted in this story, including Jasmine Crockett, Joe Biden, and Hunter Biden, are entirely fictional and created for storytelling purposes only. They do not represent real individuals, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. This work is protected under the principles of fair use and is intended for commentary, criticism, and creative expression. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful, emotional narratives that expose injustice and champion the truth, please subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue writing the kinds of stories that matter. Thank you for watching, feeling, and standing for what's right.